questions on the information from chapter 14 from Tuesday before I start here? How am I going to show them this? No questions? We're good to go? Okay. Alrighty, sorry. That map. Good. Right. We are finally organized. Okay, so a little bit on postural control and balance. Remember, this chapter is looking at the coupling of our perception of our environment that is put together in our brain based upon all the different kinds of sensory information that the brain is receiving, right? But perception is an individual item, variable, right? My perception of the environment is based upon my sensory information and the way my brain interprets that information based upon experience, right? So we have to be very careful when we're thinking about perception and not assume that someone else understands the environment the same way we do, right? It's kind of similar to the idea of affordances, right? My affordance that the environment gives me is personal, based upon my experience, right? So what I think the movement opportunities within the environment are is personal to me. Someone else is going to look at the exact same environment and interpret that differently, possibly, okay? So then we also have a lot of perceptual information, a lot of sensory information that we use to control our posture unconsciously most of the time, and our balance in different situations, right? So we use visual information. Humans are very visually dominant. They tend to use visual information over, particularly as adults, over other information that they're receiving. Auditory information can be used, kinesthetic input from pressure receptors in our feet, from the vestibular apparatus in our ears, from joint receptors, right? All this information the brain puts together to control posture and balance, right? So we have to consider the fact that posture and balance don't just happen in a stationary situation, right? They also happen in dynamic contexts, all right? So I have to maintain my posture and my balance standing still, but I also have to do that if I'm running. If I'm not able to maintain posture and balance, then running becomes tripping and I fall over. We also have to consider different body parts. We don't always balance on our feet, right? So with the balance pads that I have, that I play with the children on, sometimes we balance on our knees, sometimes we balance on our bottom, sometimes we balance on our tummy, right? If you think about diving, if you watch the dives where they're going off the solid platform, the high platform really, really high up, they'll often do handstands right on the edge of that platform and then create the dive, right? So lots of different situations where we need to be able to control our balance and posture. And what we see is when we measure those, it's very specific to the environment and the task constraints. And that gives us it means that our triangle that we've been using all semester with our individual, our environmental, and our task constraints is a really good tool to understand posture and balance in different situations here, okay? So in chapter 9, we looked at some information around posture control and balance in little people. So we're going up to preschool and above now, okay? And we see that balance continues to improve across time, and that pattern again is very task specific, right? So, for example, when I used to coach gymnastics full time, I would do the preschool classes during the day, and then I would do the elite kids in the evening. So with the preschool classes, it was really interesting because if I put a floor beam down, right, so it's just barely off the floor, and I asked the children to walk along the beam, they couldn't do it, they couldn't balance, right? They would step off to the side, they would look all around the room, and if I used that as an assessment of their ability to balance, I would have been scoring them very low. But what I found very interesting was if I put them up on a regular high competitive level beam with only one crash mat underneath, the beam is exactly the same. It's 4 inches wide. The floor beam is 4 inches wide. The only difference is the floor beam is right on the floor and the Olympic level beam is about this high. And I tell them to walk along the beam. Now they can walk the whole length of the beam, jump off the beam onto the crash mat without falling off. Right? So it wasn't that they couldn't balance on the floor beam, it was that they didn't have to balance on the floor beam because the floor was right there, so if they stepped off there was no repercussion. Right? So that was one of the things that got me really interested in this idea when I came into grad school and I found out about constraints theory, that experience back in the gym was one of the things that really made constraints theory meaningful for me, because I had struggled with explaining why these 3-year-olds could balance on a great big high beam where you think they would be scared and they would fall off, but they couldn't balance on a floor beam where there was nothing to be frightened of. Right? And I didn't have the tools to explain what I was observing, what I was seeing for real in the gym, right? And I think we discussed this in chapter 9, right? Think about all the different sensory experiences and sensory information that you're receiving. Which systems are in conflict when you feel like you're moving because the car or the train or the plane next to you starts to move, right? And you sort of do this sway in your seat, and then you realize it's not you, it's not your form of transport that is doing the moving. Which systems are in conflict there, right? Why does the brain get confused? So what did I say we were dominant in? Come on, it's It's not a trick question.
Okay, word that again one more time. Like I'm having a hard time understanding the question.
Okay.
What are we dominating in?
I want to know which sensory systems are in conflict when you feel like you're moving and you're not moving. So you're sitting on the plane and the plane in the next bay over pulls out and you sway.
That would be your visual and your kinesthetic.
Say that again.
Visual and kinesthetic?
Yeah, okay, that's good, right? So our visual sensory information that's coming in from our peripheral vision tells the brain that there's movement, right? Because it's two-dimensional information. So all the brain gets is there's movement of an object across the retina, right? But all our kinesthetic information and our vestibular information is telling the brain that we're not moving. And yet, we sway and the brain thinks we're moving because we tend to rely on our visual information over everything else that we're being told. It's why it's so important if you work with young children or you're working with athletes or even with older people, although you've got to be a little bit wary how you would set that up if you were a physical therapist, for example, and you're working with an elderly patient. You've got to be a little bit careful how you do this kind of work. But it's really important that we do closed eye work with the kids and with the athletes, right? We should make them stand with their eyes closed. We should make them turn around in circles with their eyes closed. We should make them balance on one foot with their eyes closed. Because we need to teach the brain to pay more attention to the kinesthetic information it's receiving so that it can make better judgments, right? Because, for example, if I'm on a ladder, okay, and I'm having to lean a long way out, then my visual information gets skewed, right? And I may feel like I'm off balance when actually my kinesthetic information is telling me, no, you're fine. You're on balance, right? And there are situations in sport and just general life where if I can pay more attention to my kinesthetic awareness, then I could prevent myself getting hurt, right? So doing lots of stuff with your eyes shut is really useful learning for your brain, right? So try it yourself next time you get up and go to make a cup of coffee or something. See if you can stand straight on to something, close your eyes and turn around in a circle and then open your eyes, right? Even I'm slightly off, right? I stopped too late, so if I do it, there we go, that one was better, right? See if you can do it. It's an interesting test. So more recent research has been looking at what kind of strategies do children and adults use to maintain equilibrium and balance in different situations. And so they're looking at the development of balance strategies across the lifespan. So the film clip that I showed you when we were looking at chapter 9, that moving room situation, that's some of the information that looks at these strategies. And we have to recognize that typically, if I'm doing a static task, I rely on this sensory feedback to keep me stable, right? visual, kinesthetic, joint receptors, all these things. Okay? But when I'm doing dynamic tasks, I can't react to the task and try to maintain my balance after the effect. Right? So what we see with dynamic balance tasks is that we have a feed-forward system, right? So the brain preps the musculature ahead of time to keep us on balance, right? So how do I control my hips? How do I control my head? How do I control my legs, right? It has to do that ahead of time. So if we do EMG work on a dynamic task, what you see is that the muscles turn on before the task starts, right? Or think about hurdling, for example, right? If I'm a competitive hurdler, look at how fast those people run that race, right? And yet they're able to leap, right? Because they take off one foot and they stretch the other leg out, and then they pick up the back leg and come over the hurdle. So that's a leap. Take off one foot, land on the other foot. And keep running really fast. Right? And they tend to not fall over unless they hit the hurdle or catch their foot on the hurdle. And that throws them off their balance. Imagine how complicated that must be for the brain to organize and control that and keep that athlete on balance. Right? That's why this stuff is so cool. It's just fascinating. Because we don't stop and think about what the brain is doing for that movement pattern to be achieved successfully. And when we do stop and think, that's when I get all excited about it, because it's just like, wow, that's so cool. So when we're moving and trying to balance, one of the terms you'll see in the textbook, and you'll see it a lot of times in other resources, all right, is the term degrees of freedom. All right, so what the brain has to learn to do is control the degrees of freedom within the movement. So the degrees of freedom is how many ways can a particular thing move. So like in my elbow, the degree of freedom is 1, right? Because my elbow only moves in one direction. But in my shoulder, right, it can do all kinds of things. So it's a much more complicated joint to control. The hips are much more complicated than the knee that only has 2 degrees of freedom. It can bend and stretch, and it can rotate a little bit, right? So, you know, controlling these degrees of freedom is key. And when we look at the development of our gross motor skills, think about our catching. What the brain does with a beginner is it shuts down, just freezes all the degrees of freedom, right? So our beginner catcher doesn't move their legs, doesn't move their arms, right? Everything is tightened up. And then gradually, as we get more experience, we are able to move around and become more variable. As a coach or a teacher, do you find yourself telling a beginner, you've got to just relax, you're too stiff. Relax a little bit more, right? They're stiff because the brain is controlling these degrees of freedom that it doesn't understand how to control moving around yet. Does that make sense?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah? So, think of some surfaces that make balancing difficult, all right? So we've had a classic one this week, right, with the snow and the ice. Changes people's walking patterns, typically, right? Because I don't want to slip. So instead of pushing off and taking a big step, I push off more gently and I take smaller steps. Make sure that I think about chapter 3, I have to keep my center of gravity over my base of support. So I take shorter steps to make sure that that's what's happening. I don't want to risk slipping and falling. Right? What other surfaces make balancing difficult?
If there's something inflated underneath, like the balance pads that you had the kids working on in the film, those small ones.
Yeah.
Like those balls, those balls that they use for like physical therapy.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? What about if I go hiking? What might I come across when I'm hiking that makes balance more difficult?
Rocks.
Rocks, right? Stones, slippy sand. That's why we like our walking poles, because if I use my walking poles, I immediately increase my base of support and I'm less likely to fall. Right? Okay. And then, what strategies do you use? Right? And the strategies are unconsciously tightly tied to some of those principles that we learned in chapter 3. So if I'm climbing uphill and I'm going up a steep hill, do I stand upright? What do I do if I'm going up something very steep? Do I do that? I lean forward.
Lean?
Yeah, right. Because if I lean backwards, it moves my center of gravity way out, and there's a great big steep slope behind me, so I haven't got any chance of recovering my balance if I lean back, right? So I lean forward, and that gives me more wiggle room for rocky surfaces and things. Does that make sense? Right? It's not as complicated. It's just a question of thinking, what would I actually do, right? Put yourself in that position. What would I do if I'm going uphill with a pack? I lean forward. The bit that makes you better than anybody else is understanding the why you lean forward. Right? What's going on in the brain that encourages that change in behavior? Because it all comes back to our constraints triangle, right? I change the environment, therefore I see a different movement pattern emerge. So, what they see with infants, right? So, start at when they start walking. So, a new walker is somewhere around 12 months old, right? And what they do is they perturb that new walker. And if it's a brand new walker, when they perturb them, so they move the surface or they push them a little bit, they fall over. They don't move their feet. Right? With about 3 months or so, 2.5 to 3 months, so what's that? 10 to 12 weeks worth of walking experience. When they perturb them, they take a step forward to regain their balance. So again, it's a learning curve for the brain. What do I do? Right? If you trip, right, on the edge of a carpet or something, as strong, healthy young adults, you probably don't fall over. You take a couple of little steps, oops, she says, throwing her microphone all over the place, right? And you regain your balance. You might feel a bit foolish for the tripping, but you don't fall. Okay? So, again, we see this anticipatory postural adjustment before moving, right? And what have I done here? I did something wrong there. So when we start to walk, we see our muscles in our core and our hips and our quads all start to contract before we initiate the step, right? And the more experience we have with locomotion, the better coordinated those contractions are to make sure that we're stable, right? The frame of reference information won't be on the exam. Let me give you that hint right now. But what they see, because I think it's quite interesting, but it's a little bit outside where I want to go with the information. What they see is that children and adults, so kids who are 7, 8 and older, can judge, and again, not conscious, right? They can judge by the pull of gravity on them that they need to adjust their feet, for example, right? They understand that off balance a little bit earlier. Children younger than 7 don't pick that up quite so well. They tend to use vision more to help them stay on balance. So in a similar idea to that moving room, another piece of equipment that they use in the biomechanics lab is a force platform. Okay, and then what they did was they made the force platform movable, so they put it up on little wheels instead of setting it in the floor. Right, and so what they found is with younger adults your age and older than you, but young adults, right? If you stand them on the force platform and you move the force platform quite slowly, that they sway, but where the muscle contraction is going to keep them on balance is in their ankles, right? So I just stand and sway. If it's a slow perturbation. If, however, I surprise them and I suddenly do a great big fast hard perturbation, then what we see is that younger adults will use their hips, right? So they use their ankles for small ones, and then they'll use their hips to keep them on balance if the perturbation is bigger. That's interesting because what we see with older adults is some information that gives us some idea why it's so much harder to keep older adults on balance, right? So the first thing that happens is when you perturb the surface, it takes longer for the muscles to turn on to maintain the balance. So there's a delay in the contraction. Now, that delay might be because of degradation in the neural system, or it could be degradation in the muscular system. right? And you quite often will see them use the back to front pattern. So when I perturb them slowly, they'll use their hips and they tend to use their knees a little bit more. But if I perturb them really hard, they'll try and control it with their ankles, which is back to front and doesn't work, and then they fall. Right? So, environmental constraints, like the snow and the ice, right? Or a rug in the house that isn't tight, okay? Or a chair that I go to sit in and the chair wobbles, right? Because one leg is short or not screwed in tightly. Okay? They're much more challenging situations for older adults, whereas you guys would not even think twice about it. Right? So what's going on then that we see this difficulty in maintaining balance with older adults? So some of it we think is due to changes that are occurring in the sensory receptors and the ability to send sensory information. So in some adults, as they get older, we see changes in the kinesthetic receptors and how well they do their job. So we see some degradation. So for example, particularly in the lower limbs, the pressure receptors in their feet or the joint receptors in their ankles and their knees, right? Don't quite do the job as well as they did when they were younger. And so they become much more reliant on that visual information again. And as we know, visual information can trick your brain. Right? We also see some changes in the vestibular system in the inner ear, and that's highly linked with balance and understanding, am I upright, am I tipping, am I twisting, right? Being able to understand tipping and twisting is all to do with the vestibular ear, right? So if we see degradation in those systems, then that would automatically change the kind of information the brain is receiving, right? If we're diabetic, okay, one of the side effects of diabetes, one of the bad side effects of diabetes, is neuropathy. So we start to see degradation of the actual nerves. And so people who are diabetic often can't feel their feet very well. And if I can't feel my feet properly, then it's difficult to balance. Also means, and this is an aside, but something to be worth paying attention to. If you're working with someone who's diabetic, you need to make very certain that their shoes and their socks fit well, right? Because if they get a blister, right? Like when we get a blister, you know you've got a blister. You can feel it coming before it's, you know, and it's great if you're at home and you can take your socks and shoes off and change shoes. But if you're out in the middle of the wilderness area and your boots are giving you a blister, you're kind of stuffed, but you know it's coming, right? And you can adjust your pattern, or you can stop and put a Band-Aid on the blister or whatever. If we're diabetic and it's quite advanced, they don't feel that blister. So they don't know that they're getting a blister, and the problem is that then a blister turns into something much worse, right? And then they can get gangrene, and then they lose a limb, right? Which happens a lot for diabetics. So we might also be seeing loss of strength, particularly in older adults who have not maintained physical activity as they got older, right? Because genetically, just normally, as we get older, we start to lose those type 2 muscle fibers, the ones that can contract quickly and are stronger. Those go away as we get older, in part, right? So that loss of strength is partly just what happens as you get older, and partly due to if I didn't maintain a physical activity program, then my legs are getting weaker. They could have arthritis in their knee joints or their hip joints, for example. And there's some indication that we see slower nerve conduction. So the motor cortex fires the information off for the motor pattern, and it takes a little bit longer to get down to the muscles that need to contract to create that motor pattern than it does when we're younger. Okay? So why is this such a big deal, right? The reason this is such a big deal is that falls in older adults who are older than 75 is the leading cause of accidental death in that age group. And the other statistic that is quite scary is that if I fall and I break my hip as an older person, there's a 60% chance I won't survive out the year. Okay? So this is important. Older people may not know those specific statistics, but they know that falling is problematical, right? And so that then becomes a functional constraint because they get hesitant, right? They get fearful of falling, and then being fearful and being hesitant and having less confidence means that I've changed the interaction and I see a different movement pattern, right? They start walking slowly, they start taking very small steps. They might not actually need to take those small steps, but they're so scared of falling over, they'd rather take the small steps and make everything take longer. Okay? So it's important that we understand what's going on. Again, if you're going to be a physical therapist, or if you're going to, hopefully you have parents and grandparents, right, that you're going to be able to watch and help. So interestingly, what we see is even with older adults, if we give them a training program that is specifically geared to improving their balance, we see improvement, even in people who are 80, 85 years old. So we can help them stay stronger and maintain their balance more effectively so that they don't have to be so scared, and that can impact not just their immediate health and the fear of falling, but impact their whole quality of life, right? So, I can give them training programs. I did a course a couple of years ago where the researcher had taken Tai Chi, which is an excellent form of exercise. He'd taken Tai Chi and adapted it slightly to stress balance in older people. And he was teaching people that worked in homes for the elderly, or worked for the state with elderly populations. Dr. Berkey and I got into it just because we got the information and thought, oh, that would be cool to learn, right? So we can give them these training programs, and that improves their quality of life. It improves their leg strength. If their legs are stronger, remember my balance stuff from chapter 3, the stronger my legs are, the more able I am to keep my center of gravity over my base of support, and we see a reduction in falls. So think again, right? And you may or may not be going physical therapy ideas, but think about what would you do with your grandparents or with your parents as they get elderly? What kind of equipment could you use, right? I wouldn't put my 84-year-old dad on one of those balance pads that I put the children on, right? Because I think that's a little bit extreme. And the chances of him falling, because they're so wobbly, I'm not going to risk that, right? But I could get some big stones, right, and make a surface with a chair and get him to stand on the stones. I've seen people use the big bubble wrap. Right? We have to be flexible. We have to be able to adapt, because the equipment we would use with our athletes to help them maintain their balance or relearn their balance after certain surgeries may not be practical to use with an older population. Right? So there's a little bit on assessing balance in the chapter. Again, very relevant for PT, might be relevant, Kayla, in a PE scenario. If you've got a child who seems to be having issues with their balance, how do I assess that? You know, a force plate is great, but we don't always have access to a force plate, all right? But how do I perturb their balance? If I put them on one foot and then I give them a little poke, right, what happens? Or what if I ask them what can they feel with their feet? So if I have them working in bare feet, I can give them different, they got wrecked, unfortunately, but I used to have some tactile discs that you can buy in any PE catalog, right? And they've got different types of surfaces on the discs, and you get the children to stand on the disc. What can they feel? Can they match it to a smaller version of the disc that they can feel with their hand? Or are they having trouble recognizing the sensory information from their feet? Right? What happens when we take vision away? Ta-da! Questions?
I think we've pretty much covered.
It's really interesting. I strongly recommend that you read that chapter in quite a lot of detail, because they go into, obviously there's a lot more information in that chapter than I can cover in class. But I think that it's one of the chapters that will change, in my view. It will change how you approach teaching certain skills. And that can't be a bad thing, right? To give yourself some more tools for the toolbox. Okay? All right, where are we? 10:15? Okey-dokey. Do you want to take a 2-minute water break, pee break? Or do you want me just to keep going?
I mean, it'll be cool to keep going while we already at it. I mean, if you need to break up, that's fine too.
I'm okay. Kayla, you okay?
I'm good as well.
All right, then let's keep going. And I'm just going to do 6 or 7 of these slides, I think. And then we'll have plenty of time to finish off chapter 15 on Tuesday next week, and maybe start a little bit of chapter 16 Okay, so we're going into some information that sometimes people get a little defensive about because it's connected with how we're brought up, and so we get quite protective of those things. But it's something that we maybe typically would not consider that can dramatically impact the types of movement skills that people learn, right? So, when we first did our triangle, way back, we said that environmental constraints could be divided into two groups. We have the physical ones like gravity, the surface, the weather, right? And then we have these social, cultural type constraints, all right? So we're looking, this chapter is all about constraints that would be considered under that environmental corner of the triangle, okay? So it involves the atmosphere that is created based upon the attitudes of the group that you are part of. And the group could be as big as the society you live in, right? It could be the family group. It could be your peer group, all right? But the attitudes of the group have a strong impact on motor development, which might seem a little bit odd to begin with until we dig into this idea, all right? So each culture, each group have their own value systems, their own mores that they follow and trust, the norms, the stereotypes that they hold, and culturally specific concepts about movement behaviors can impact what I learn and what I don't learn. So in the States, we learn to play baseball, but in the UK, you don't learn to play baseball, you learn to play cricket, right? So just because I live in two different countries affords me the opportunity to learn completely different motor skills, right? Sometimes the media reinforces these concepts, okay? Particularly when we start looking at what we consider appropriate for certain groups, right? The media will enforce. I remember, I think it was Lindsey Vonn, who was a downhill skier, was really irritated with the constant questions about what her hair was like, what makeup did she wear, right? Because it's irrelevant to her winning a gold medal at the Olympics, right? So the media can reinforce some of these ideals and concepts that our cultures and our societies teach us. Okay? So they're pervasive attitudes that come from the group that influence behaviors of people within that group. So what I mean is that it's not necessarily deliberate, right? It's internal, it's learned, it's something, it's like a blueprint that I just follow without thinking about it, right? And these ideas and attitudes can encourage certain movement patterns, right, that are deemed socially acceptable perhaps, like baseball in America, and they can discourage other movement patterns that wouldn't be considered useful within that movement pattern, within that society or culture, right? So why, as a PE teacher, would I spend time teaching netball as a unit when netball, I don't think anyone plays netball in America, maybe I'm wrong, but I've never even seen it mentioned over here, right? But in school, you play netball every winter, right? It's a winter game. And every winter for 5 years, you have to put up with playing netball, right? So, again, it's not necessarily a positive and a negative, right? We mustn't think that not learning netball because it's discouraged in America is a bad thing. It's just different, right? It's encouraging or discouraging the emergence of certain movement patterns. That doesn't necessarily always mean that that's a positive or a negative. It can be, but it isn't always. All right? So it plays a large role in the motor behaviors that are adopted and learned by the children and individuals in that cultural society, right? And the choices they make as we get older, right? So on page 306, they ask you a question, right? Think back to when you were younger. What influences were there in your life that encouraged you to become good movers? What do you remember was an influence?
This might vary from family to family, but I know in my brother and I, we had to play a sport. Like, we had to figure out what our thing was, and our parents had it just kind of ingrained in us from the beginning that you were going to play a sport.
Okay, so your parents were the initial influence because they felt, luckily for you, that being physically active and being involved in a sport was a positive for you. So that might have been driven by their understanding of the health outcomes of being involved in a sport, or it might have been driven by their belief that being involved in a sport would help to discipline you and it would change behavior patterns for you, right? Or it'll make you more disciplined, and therefore that discipline will transfer into your schoolwork. Okay, so there might have been several different reasons why your parents made that a thing in your house. And you're right, your first statement was absolutely right. The whole point of this is it's very different in every house, right? My experience is different. My parents encouraged us to be physically active. I chose to be very physically active. My sister chose to be pretty sedentary. And then I got into gymnastics because my parents would watch the Olympics on the telly, and I saw gymnastics on the telly in 1972, and I was like, oh, I want to do that. And instead of saying, no, we can't afford it, my parents said, okay, let's see if we can find somewhere for you. Right? What about you, Gene?
I started playing sports because my friends, that's what they were doing. So they were like signing up for organized sports. So I was just, forced to, well, not forced, but I learned to love sports as well.
You tagged along because you wanted to be with your peer group, and then you found out you really liked it.
Exactly.
Right? So there are always these social and cultural influences that we don't really pay attention to. But they're very interesting when you start to come across people that do things a little bit differently, perhaps. Right? So this socialization process that is ongoing, right? It goes all the time. We just, again, we're not really aware that it's happening a lot of the time, all right? My role, learning my role within my culture or my society is built on 3 factors that interact and create my understanding of who I am in this role, right? One is socializing agents. So socializing agents are people who are significant to you, influential people. So that's typically when we're younger, that's likely to be our parents. As we get older, it becomes more our peer group, right? It might be a particular PE teacher at school that absolutely makes PE so much fun that I just want to do it all the time, or a coach, right? So who are the significant others that influence you and your understanding of your role, right? And this same idea can be applied to other domains. It's just we're using it to think about movement, all right? Then we've got our social situations. So our social situations are the places that we go to socialize with others, right? So that could be at school or on the playground. It could be down at the park after school or at the weekend. Could be at the swimming pool in the summer in Portales when they have the outdoor pool open, right? What are the environments where we go to socialize, and what are the opportunities to play and games, or what toys are there, right? That's all social situations. And then the third element that plays a role is our personality. What are my personal attributes, right? Am I shy? Am I outgoing? Do I have good self-esteem? Is my perceived competence of my movement ability strong if we're looking at movement skills, right? Do I think I could try that movement skill and give it a go, or do I look at that and go, no way in hell I'm going to make an idiot of myself, right? So these 3 things kind of float together and create my social role, right? How I learn my social role, okay? So that's quite important to pay attention to, because again, if you are working with people from a different culture or a different society, their social role is going to be different than yours. And it's not your place to judge other people's perceptions and social roles, right? We're not here to judge each other. We're here to understand, why is that different, right? When I watch that child try to move and try to do this skill, why is that what I'm seeing? Okay? Is he okay? Yes. All right. So, now we come to something that I get quite excited about. Okay, so we're going to spend some time looking at gender stereotyping, gender typing, because it's rampant and it's often unconscious and not recognized, and it has a significant impact on the kinds of motor skills that I do and don't get the opportunity to learn, all right? So the first thing to understand, and given that gender is such a big media kind of beef at the moment, it's very interesting that they often use the term in the wrong place, right? So the first thing that we have to get our head around is the terminology. So sex is the biological characteristic of the individual, right? So it's an individual constraint. The majority, not everybody, but the majority of people are either male or female genetically. All right, as I said, not everybody. There are some people that have more than an XY chromosome, and that changes those characteristics a little bit. So it's an individual constraint that I'm born with. I'm either male or female. Gender, though, is not an individual characteristic. It's not genetic, it's learned. It's a socio-cultural constraint, right? Do I consider myself masculine? Am I a man? Or do I consider myself feminine? Am I a woman? Right? And this is a learned role that we develop from birth, right? We're not born with this, it's something we're taught. And again, it sounds sometimes like I'm pointing the finger at people, and I don't mean it to sound like that. I'm not saying that anybody is doing this deliberately. But as a culture, as a society, we gender type babies from the word go, right? So the research would indicate that gender is learned quite early, possibly even as young as 1 year old, all right? So I'm hoping you're going to be able to see this. I don't know. Can you see the colors in that, or do I need to put the light on? Can you see color?
We can see it.
Can you see color?
Yeah.
Okay. Whose bedroom is that? My little boys or my little boys, right? Okay. Whose bedroom is that? My little boys or my little girls?
A little girl.
Why?
Because we determined gender with pink and blue.
Right? So we're teaching our children from the minute they're born that they're a man or a woman. Right? Not that they're male or female, because that's sex, that's determined. We're teaching. Yes.
Okay, what about determining their gender before they're even out of the womb? Because now people do gender reveal parties.
Yeah, that's a load of nonsense, I think. My personal opinion. And I honestly, I've never, because every time I see the term, I just turn the screen off or I turn the page, because the term gender party makes no sense to me, personally. Because what I don't even know what they're trying to achieve in that situation, right? Do they know the sex of the baby before they have the gender party?
Some people do. Some people, like, they just wait, or it's the couple that knows and the party does not know.
So it's not really anything to do with gender, it's to do with the people at the party guessing what sex the baby is.
Yeah.
In a sense, yeah.
Right? So this goes back to what I said earlier. Right now, when gender is such a big kind of hype thing at the moment, it's very interesting because people are using the term gender in completely the wrong context. Right? I can't decide your gender, only you can decide your gender. It's nothing to do with me. Now, I can teach you what I want your gender to be, but that's I don't get to decide that, right? That's why we're having these issues now with so many young people, right? They don't feel like the gender their parents have taught them or their society has taught them they are. They want to behave in a different way. Right? And some of them go to the extent where they have surgery to make them look like the other sex, but you cannot change your sex. You can change your sexual characteristics so you look like the other sex, but that doesn't make you the other sex. Right? So it's really complicated, but for me, now is the most fascinating period of time because it's coming up all over the place. And I can sit back and go, okay, what are they really talking about? What do they mean? What are they trying to achieve? Right? So, when we're looking at physical activity, it becomes quite interesting, right? Can I differentiate between sex and gender? Right? Because until the 1970s, women weren't allowed to play many sports that are out there, right? Because sports were for boys. Girls didn't play sport, right? So it's not until my lifetime, it's way before your lifetime, but in my lifetime, things have changed for girls, females, to be able to take part in certain sports. Right? So, as with the blue and pink, I love it when guys wear a pink shirt or a pink tie. I think it looks so cool. But as with the blue and pink, right, we do the same thing with sports. We decide that our boys should take part in sports that we consider to be masculine. Right? So we encourage them to play rugby or to play American football or to go into wrestling. Right? But I'm not going to let my little darling girl go into wrestling or play rugby. Oh, no. My little darling girl has to be a ballerina or a gymnast or an ice skater. Right? And remember that at this point in their development, the parent is in charge. The parent has to pay for the activity. The parent has to transport the child to and from the activity. The parent has to go and buy the uniform or the equipment that they need for that activity, right? So, in my case, I chose gymnastics. My parents didn't put me in gymnastics. I chose it for myself. But they could have said no. Right? It was an hour's drive to the closest gym club for me to go and take gymnastics lessons. And they gave up the time to take me and let me do that. But they could have said, no, I don't have 2 hours a day to drive you back and forwards to Lewisham. You can go and play tennis down the road in the park like everybody else. Right? An interesting example that they give in the textbook is field hockey, right? So, if you're the parent or the teacher, who do you expect to play field hockey? In America, who would you expect to play field hockey? If you're in America, who would you expect expect, if you drove past a school field and there were a group of people playing field hockey, who would you expect them to be?
Definitely boys.
Boys? Okay, that's interesting. Because the books...
Because they're showing drawing it.
Yeah, and I think the book is a little out of date on this example because I think the American male hockey team have been doing quite well internationally. So I think they've got more media, right? In England, you would expect them to be girls. They don't like girls, so I was at an all-girls school, so maybe I'm wrong, but like in the winter we played netball and hockey, and in the summer we played tennis and we did track and field, right? Boys didn't learn hockey, but in